The storm rolled in without warning, the kind of late-night fury that made the old oaks around Magnolia Grove plantation groan as though the entire earth were shifting under their roots. Elellanar Blackwood paced her drawing room with restless precision, silk skirts whispering across polished floors, mind fixed on her husband's dinner guests arriving in just a few hours. Everything had to be flawless. Mr. Blackwood's reputation depended on it, and by extension, so did hers. When thunder split the quiet, she stiffened, then called sharply for the one man always within reach. Isaiah. The Bordeaux 3 bottles. Fetch them at once. Isaiah, weathered and steady at 45 years old, gave a curt nod, every line of his face composed into the careful neutrality required to survive decades in that house. He carried the lantern. She followed with quick, unsettled breaths as they descended the narrow stair into the cool stone belly beneath the mansion. The moment their feet hit the cellar floor, the wind above rose into a banshee howl. Elellanar clutched the lantern handle tighter as they moved between rows of dormant glass. The air was scented with oak and dust, old years, trapped in barrels and bottles. She murmured, half to herself, that the storm felt wrong, too violent for late summer. Isaiah simply nodded, inspecting the shelves with practiced familiarity, selecting the bottles her husband favored. Then the world gave way. One deafening crack tore through the night, followed by a violent shudder beneath their feet. Isaiah's instincts acted before. Thought he grabbed Elellanar's arm and pulled her back as a massive beam crashed down where she'd stood only seconds earlier. The lantern rocked in her trembling hand, throwing wild spirals of light across the stone as the collapsing weight of an uprooted oak slammed into the structure above them. The cellar door burst inward. Dirt, stone, and timber cascaded down in a choking avalanche. The air filled with grit so thick she could barely breathe. A scream tore from her throat, swallowed by the storm's wrath. When the cloud of dust finally settled, the reality carved itself into the dim glow. The entrance was gone. Not blocked, obliterated. A packed wall of splintered wood, broken stone, and wet soil sealed them in completely, as though the world above had buried them alive. Elellanar's breath came in ragged bursts. Isaiah, coughing, pressed a hand against the debris, testing its stability with measured, careful touches. "We can't move this," he said, voice hoarse. "If we try, we'll bring more of the ceiling down." His tone, normally muted beneath servitude, carried an authority that startled her. For a moment, he forgot the hierarchy forced onto him. For a moment. She listened. Her panic rose anyway. "My husband, his guests, someone will notice," she insisted, the words dissolving into a breathy tremor. But they both knew the truth. The storm would keep anyone from venturing out. The hands would be securing livestock and structures, not searching for a missing mistress and a house servant. Hours might pass, maybe longer. The cellar grew colder as the storm raged overhead. Elellanar shivered violently in her thin periwinkle dress, the one she had chosen specifically to impress Mrs. Preston. Dust coated the silk now, a quiet mockery. Isaiah noticed but said nothing. Instead, he moved through the cellar with purposeful calm, discovering candles and matches kept for Mr. Blackwood's private tastings. He struck a match. The tiny flare illuminated his face for a brief, fragile moment before he lit several thick beeswax candles. The golden glow softened the stone and made the cellar feel less like a tomb. Elellanar watched him, something unsettled stirring inside her. In the flickering light, the features she had overlooked for 7 years took on new clarity. The line of his jaw, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the steadiness in his movements. They conserved candles, snuffing all but 2. Thunder rolled above them, shaking dust from the ceiling. She clutched her arms for warmth as her stomach growled. Isaiah quietly retrieved preserved food stored on a back shelf, a few crackers, dried fruit, hard cheese. He arranged them on a wine crate with a precision that made the modest spread feel like a ritual. But he took almost nothing for himself. When she urged him to eat more, he hesitated, explaining in a tone both resigned and matter-of-fact. "Force of habit, ma'am. You learn to take less when you've seen men whipped for taking more." The words struck her harder than the falling beam. For the first time, she really looked at him not as property, not as a silent fixture in her household, but as a man shaped by fear and endurance she'd never dared consider. She asked how long he had lived at Magnolia Grove. "Since I was 14, he answered. 22 years. She realized with some quiet shock that she had never once wondered about his age, his life, his origins. He spoke then of his mother, sold 12 years ago to fund the expansion of her husband's east fields. The fields she had once admired for their neat rows of cotton. The realization landed heavy, a guilt she had never allowed herself to feel. The conversation unfolded gently, like layers being peeled away from a life she'd kept sealed. He had a sister in the laundry, a nephew who tamed even the most ill-tempered horses. He had a grandmother, Addis, taken from West Africa as a child. Elellanar leaned forward, drawn in despite herself. Addis had taught him the language of storms, herbs, healing. She could predict hurricanes, he said softly, eyes unfocused as though seeing a different world. Said you could smell them coming days before they hit land. He touched his chest unconsciously, where he'd hidden a small carved wooden bird, his mother's gift. She told me it would keep her spirit close. The lantern's glow wavered as the storm intensified. Elellanar realized with new fear that the light might fail. She swallowed hard. We cannot be left in darkness. Isaiah retrieved more candles, setting 2 near them while storing the rest. We'll make them last, he said. She nodded, though her hands trembled. As they ate sparingly, Elellanar asked about his grandmother's stories. For a moment he seemed unsure, as though sharing such memories with a white mistress were forbidden. But then he began speaking of river spirits who judged the hearts of those who approached, who protected the pure and pulled the wicked away. His voice carried a quiet poetry she had never heard from anyone in Charleston's society. She closed her eyes, letting his story transport her somewhere far beyond the cellar walls. Outside, the wind howled, slamming branches against the structure. A violent tremor shook loose plaster from the ceiling. Elellanar gasped. Isaiah moved instinctively, shielding her with his body until the danger passed. When he stepped back, he apologized quickly, reverting to the deference drilled into him. "You were protecting me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Their eyes met, held, broke quickly, but not before something unspoken passed between them. "You have kind eyes," she murmured before she could stop herself. The words startled them both. Isaiah lowered his gaze, but not before a flicker of something gratitude, pain, recognition, shadowed his expression. The night deepened. They both needed rest, though neither could truly sleep. Isaiah tried to arrange the cellar so she might have a softer place to sit. Wine crates, old sacks, the blanket he insisted she keep. She thanked him, the sincerity in her voice a fragile thread. She hesitated before asking, "Would you tell me one of your grandmother's stories, the old ones?" In the soft flicker of candlelight, his voice rose again, weaving a tale from a homeland he had never seen but carried in memory. As the storm continued its wild assault, the two of them sat in a circle of dim golden light, shadows dancing on stone, the world above erased. The walls around them had become prison and sanctuary, both at once, and neither of them, not even in the quietest corner of their minds, could deny the truth settling into the space between their breaths. When the cellar opened again, if it opened at all, nothing they carried back into the daylight would be the same. Morning arrived as a rumor at first, an easing of the storm's fury, the wind thinning to sharp, wet breaths, then the dull, human percussion of axes and shouted names above ground. Light found a narrow crack where rescuers had already hacked at the packed earth, and when a shaft of sunlight pierced the cellar, it cut the dim into a clean white line that made everything else look like theater. Isaiah moved to the opening with practiced calm, pressing his ear to the loose rubble until he heard men calling down. Relief washed through Elellanar in a hot, dizzy wave. For a second she imagined herself already upstairs among the carved chairs and polished silver, laughing about the ordeal when visitors congratulated her composure. Yet even as she climbed toward that fantasy, she felt the cellar's memory like a second skin. The darkness had taught her to see, taught her to count another person's breath as a separate world. When they were hauled out, the yard smelled of wet earth and crushed leaves, and the angry tang of men's labor. Richard Blackwood stood above the broken entrance, his boots planted on the new chaos like a general surveying a misfired charge. Relief flickered across his face for only a breath before he smoothed it into proprietary annoyance. "Elellanar," he called, voice thick with a man's obligation to appear unshaken. He barely glanced at Isaiah, as though he had not been there at all, only a tool in the night. People crowded, questions ricocheted, and the day resumed its social choreography. Elellanar's dress was ruined, her hair escaped its pins, and dirt clung to the hems of her silk like an accusation. She tried to fold the Cellar's truth into the neat pocket of a grateful smile. She survived, she would tell them, and that would be the end of it. But the end did not come. Rescue was not a return to the same terms. In the light of day, roles reasserted themselves with brutal efficiency. Isaiah blended back into the house's rhythm, placing silver, catching a handkerchief, refilling glasses with a fluid invisibility, while Elellanar learned quickly how to make her face right for visitors. Yet each time she watched him move, she saw not a shadow, but a whole person. When she caught herself making eye contact, she felt the quick, unfamiliar sting of recognition. It was like waking from a vivid dream and finding some small, precise thing had shifted in the room's architecture. Life resumed with the speed of obligation. Richard demanded recompense for the ruined evening. A grander gathering was arranged. New menu items, special linens. He assumed the social world would patch itself over with enough ostentation. He assumed, too, that the household would return to its habitual silence about what had happened below. Elellanar went through the motions, making lists, approving menus, practicing light laughter. But in the private minutes between tasks, she found herself thinking of names she had learned. Naomi folding laundry in the kitchen, Jeremiah whispering to a stallion, the small carved bird Isaiah kept near his chest. Those names clotted inside her like small, urgent petitions. A private hour in the library felt like refuge and confession both. Isaiah entered with a feather duster as if he belonged only to the room's air. His hands were steady, his posture the same daylight deference, but the cadence of his voice when she spoke to him there carried a different weight. "You recited Shakespeare the other night," she said, half to test the boundary of this new familiarity. He paused a fraction, dusting the highest shelf as though to hide his hesitation. "Mr. Blackwood keeps good books, ma'am," he answered carefully, but there was nothing evasive in the way he tucked the phrase under his words. "When the Reverend Wilson left a volume, I learned what I could." There was something in the air, something she had not known until it was gone, that made ordinary gazes feel like betrayals. She asked about his family, and he told her the small facts, voices flattened by practice. Mary, childish, soft-voiced, was to be sold, he said, and the word sold landed like a fist. Elellanar's mind opened and poured in the details. Mary was only 14, Naomi's cousin, the sort of child whose laugh made the kitchen burn a little brighter. The idea that Richard would list Mary as a commodity hardened something in Elellanar's chest. She had once thought of the plantation's order as inevitable. Now it resembled a ledger of human currency, and she could no longer read its entries without feeling nausea. She began small at first, performing charity as women like her had always done, discreet gifts of food and extra blankets, whispered instructions to the cook to save a portion for the quarters. Each act felt both like a balm and a betrayal, because it left the structure intact. That truth gnawed at her. Kindness without consequence was a way to salve a conscience, but not to dismantle the mechanics of cruelty. She wanted more than crumbs of comfort for those who would be sold. The thought didn't arrive as a sudden thunderclap. It coaxed itself into being, patient and insistent, like seed pushed toward light. Richard announced the liquidation of assets with a casual, businesslike tone at dinner, as if he were discussing horses rather than people. He spoke of politics in Charleston, of securing liquidity should the times go unsettled. Elellanar felt each syllable lodge in the air like a boulder tipping the scale. Her mouth formed protest, but Richard waved it away. Practical men distrust the moral. They prefer ledgers. He named names that chilled her. A field hand on the East Fields, a kitchen girl, possibly 2 house servants. Elellanar's reply was soft but firm, a plea for discretion, a request that the boy in the gardens be spared because his skill with the ornamental beds reflected well on the house. Richard shrugged and called it a compromise. To him it was merely an inventory adjustment. To Elellanar, the thought of Mary's small body shipped south made her hands cold. One evening, standing on the back stairs while the household hummed around the evening meal, Elellanar made a decision that had the tremor of a dangerous thing. She arranged for Isaiah to be called to her chamber under a pretense of moving a heavy mirror. When the door clicked behind them, the two were suddenly in a room she had always reserved for privacy and nothing else. She closed the door and listened to the house's routine clanking china, muffled laughter, but those noises seemed distant, like life in another language. "There will be a sale next Thursday," she said, setting the facts down like stones on a table. She watched for his reaction. The light in the room was a yellow hush that made his face solemn. Isaiah's eyes tightened. "Mary?" he asked. He did not need to be told more. Elellanar told him what she could: dates, names, Richard's trip to Charleston that would remove him from the house for a narrow window. "There are roots," he said, voice low and careful. He did not name them like a boast. He treated them like rumors that had to be handled with the greatest care. Whispers of people who help, of paths north, of households in Charleston that moved silently for those who had to leave like ghosts. The phrase Underground Railroad had the weight of myth. He said it in fragments and cautions, telling her about contacts he had heard of but not trusted, about the risk of being caught. Elellanar felt the full circumference of the danger. Discovery could mean ruin for her reputation and destruction for those she sought to protect. They planned in fragments at first, like knotting rope in the dark, small, discreet moves rather than grand gestures. He would not leave the quarters much. Her household could not notice sudden slack in the fabric. She would create diversions. A night sickness in the cook, an argument staged between workers so that attention would tilt elsewhere. She would speak to the Parker agent with the ease of a woman who could negotiate cloth and carriage schedules. She would dig for information under the outward performance of decorum. Each step required patience and guile. Each step increased the risk. The moral weight of her choice settled on her like a coat, heavy and oddly fitting. She had the household's currency and a husband's absent-minded indulgence to mask small manipulations. But every act carried an unspoken cost. Isaiah counseled caution. "Make no sudden moves, ma'am." And the warning was not merely about being discreet. It was about survival. He also taught her where to look without being obvious. The names of trusted neighbors in Charleston, the times when agents shifted their attentions, the way a servant's note might be smuggled inside a seam or a baked good. He spoke of pedagogy and patience, of reading people as books you could learn to understand page by page. As Thursday approached, Richard announced his sudden departure for Charleston, citing urgent business to ensure a better return on the East Fields. His boots hit the floor with a jaunty certainty that set Elellanar's heart racing. His absence would be the slender window they needed, but it would also close if mishandled. The house buzzed with preparation for the sale day even as the harvest waned in the fields. Elellanar moved through both worlds, the one of silk and guests and polite laughter, and the one of whispered plans and urgent, secret kindnesses. She staged small acts, calling Mary under the pretense of learning a new stitch, slipping the girl a coin wrapped in a scrap of cloth, sending an extra blanket to Naomi. And all the while, she felt both more awake and more culpable than she had ever allowed herself to be. On the night before the departure, they met again in the library, this time on equal footing, not by law but by necessity. The space between them had a new gravity. "If you do this," Isaiah said quietly, "don't do it in a way that will bring more harm. The system will not be fooled without a price. You must be ready to bear it." Elellanar absorbed the words, tasting the responsibility like iron. She had imagined heroics. She now understood the arithmetic of rescue. One life saved might mean another's peril, unless cunning and silence and luck aligned. She pressed her hand to the carved wooden bird he kept near his heart, feeling the small warmth of it through his fingers, the talisman of a family's persistence. They ended that night without a plan that could promise victory, only with a map of small, precise actions and the knowledge that the first step had already been taken. When Richard stepped into his carriage at dawn, the world spun forward into a sequence of risk and hope. Elellanar watched him go, the house looking like the theater. Set it often resembled beautiful, ordered, indifferent. Behind her, the quarters breathed. Ahead of her, a path that might, in 3 days' time, be the thin line between a child's life being auctioned away and a child crossing toward a dangerous, uncertain freedom. The days before Thursday unfurled like tightly wound rope, every hour stretched thin by the weight of anticipation. Magnolia Grove seemed to breathe differently now, as if the house itself sensed something moving beneath its polished veneer. Elellanar carried herself with the same quiet grace society had sculpted into her. Yet beneath that mask her pulse thrummed with a new, fierce resolve. She moved through routines with mechanical ease, ordering linens, approving menus, responding to invitations. But her real work happened in the shadows between those tasks, in the stolen minutes when no one was watching except the walls that had absorbed too many secrets. Isaiah worked with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. He could not show fear or urgency, but Elellanar sensed a tension beneath every measured gesture of service. He adjusted candelabras as though marking time, polished silver while counting footsteps in the hall, and passed through rooms with the silent calculation of a man assessing danger at every turn. In the quarters at dusk, he spoke quietly with Naomi, instructing her how to keep Mary calm without revealing too much. Rumors of a sale always circulated with dread. Isaiah knew that fear could make people reckless, and recklessness could undo every careful thread they were weaving. Elellanar's first task was misdirection. On Tuesday afternoon, she sent Martha, her maid, to fetch a tincture from the doctor in town, claiming a sudden headache that required a specifically compounded remedy. The household paused for a moment, worried for their mistress's health, but she waved their concerns aside. She needed Martha out of the house, not for her own comfort, but to create an absence that disrupted the usual flow. With Martha gone, the kitchen staff scrambled to cover additional duties. Elellanar requested an elaborate tea service at an unusual hour, forcing the household to focus its attention on porcelain and pastries rather than on who was delivering small leather satchels to the laundry house behind the smokehouse. Inside one such satchel was a letter she had spent the night composing by candlelight. It was addressed to a Charleston household known in whispers only one of those rare southern homes rumored to offer aid to the desperate. She did not know whether it would be effective or whether it would condemn her if intercepted, but she wrote with the urgency of someone who understood that silence was a form of violence. She signed it with an alias, one she had overheard a visiting lady mention in gossip about distant cousins up north. Then she sealed it and entrusted it to Naomi. Naomi, whose hands trembled when she accepted it but whose voice held steady when she said, "I'll get it to who it needs to find." Elellanar's second task was ensuring Mary could disappear without immediate suspicion. She knew Richard's inventory lists, the meticulous ledger entries he made about every servant, horse, and tool. If Mary simply vanished, Isaiah would be the first blamed, and the overseer would extract answers with cruelty. Elellanar needed something more cunning, a reason for Mary's absence that did not immediately shout escape. That reason came from an accident Elellanar carefully staged the night before Richard's return. After dinner, she walked through the kitchen, complimenting the cook on the meal, acting every bit the attentive mistress. Then, with a subtle jerk of her foot, she toppled a stack of pottery bowls, sending them crashing into a scattered mosaic across the scuffed floor. The sound startled the staff, and Mary, startled by the noise, backed too quickly into the hot range. Her thin forearm brushed the iron edge, leaving a reddening welt. Elellanar rushed forward immediately, placing a cold cloth over the bruise, scolding the cook for keeping the stove too hot. Mary bit down on her lip rather than cry, but Elellanar sensed the injury might provide precisely the excuse they needed. A small burn could justify a few days of rest in the laundry house, or even the sick quarters. If Mary were kept from household duties under the guise of recovery, her absence on Thursday morning would not raise immediate alarm. Isaiah understood the value instantly. That night, He whispered through the laundry house window to Naomi. "Keep Mary inside until Elellanar arrived." Naomi nodded, her eyes full of fear and gratitude mixed into something raw. Elellanar did come, with salve and linen bandages, performing the role of compassionate mistress, while planting seeds of misdirection in every watcher's mind. "She must not work tomorrow," she insisted. "The burn needs rest." No one argued. A mistress's compassion, however unusual, was still command. The third task, coordinating Mary's departure, rested entirely on Isaiah's ability to navigate the tense, watchful currents of the quarters. The route north could not begin at Magnolia Grove. The overseer's reach stretched miles into the surrounding woods. But there were guides who lived in the thin spaces, people who left no written mark, traveling by night, passing messages through work, songs, or etched symbols on trees. Isaiah had not spoken their names to Elellanar. Some secrets were too dangerous to share. But he had contact with a man who came each week to sharpen tools. That man, quiet and unremarkable in his workman's clothes, knew how to reach the next safe point on the clandestine map. Isaiah had traded small favors with him over the years: information, hours of extra labor, the sharpening of tools he did not even need sharpened to earn a sliver of trust. Wednesday night, Elellanar slept poorly, her dreams full of shifting earth and candle smoke. She woke before dawn with a start, convinced she'd heard footsteps in the hallway. When she opened her door, the corridor lay empty. The house breathed shallowly around her, the dawn not yet strong enough to burn away the shadows. She felt the weight of the coming day, the way one feels the pressure of a storm an hour before the sky reveals it. Richard returned that evening, coat soaked from the ride but spirits lifted by business. He spoke at dinner about cotton profits and political rumblings, about shipments delayed and agents arriving at sunrise. He praised Elellanar for maintaining the household with competence in his absence, barely noticing how her fork paused mid-lift every time he mentioned the sale. When he retired early, Elellanar felt the final hour tick into place. Everything was ready, or as ready as the two of them could make it. Thursday morning broke bright and deceptively peaceful, the air washed clean of the storm's memory. Men gathered early in the yard, discussing the sale in loud, confident voices. Richard's agent arrived with a small, leather-bound ledger, the kind used to tally souls with the same care afforded livestock or grain. Elellanar felt bile rise in her throat at the sound of pages turning. Mary, tucked away in the quarters, sat on a cot with her bandaged arm resting on her lap. Naomi sat beside her, murmuring reassurances in a voice much steadier than her hands. Isaiah arrived quietly before sunrise, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were items Mary would need: a strip of dried meat, a tin cup, a cotton bonnet to block the sun from her face, and 2 coins Elellanar had slipped into Isaiah's palm without a word. When he handed the bundle to Mary, the girl looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. I don't know the way," she whispered. Isaiah said softly, "You won't go alone." He placed a hand on her shoulder, then turned to Naomi. "Take her to the creek's bend. The workmen will meet you there. After that, trust what you're told. Don't ask questions." Elellanar could not be seen near the quarters that morning. Instead, she stood on the veranda as the men assembled. Her dress rustled in the mild breeze. She looked every bit the serene plantation mistress, smiling faintly, offering coffee, pretending not to hear her heart pounding. Richard flipped through his ledger. "Where's the kitchen girl?" "Mary," he called. One of the house servants answered immediately. "In the sick quarters, sir. Burned her arm on the range." Richard grunted, displeased but unconcerned. "We'll have the agent inspect her anyway. If she's strong enough to work, she's strong enough to sell." Elellanar braced herself. This was the moment that could unravel everything. But before the overseer could be dispatched, a commotion erupted near the stables. A horse reared thunderclap. The temperamental stallion and men rushed toward the noise. The overseer cursed, sprinting to help. Richard turned his attention away from the inventory entirely, barking orders to contain the animal. The agent followed, irritated by the delay. Panic rippled through the yard as the horse snapped a rein and kicked erratically, its hooves slicing through the air. Elellanar's breath caught. She recognized the opportunity instantly, sudden chaos pulling eyes away from everything else. Isaiah, positioned near the house with a water bucket, gave her the briefest, most imperceptible nod. The distraction had been anticipated. Jeremiah, Isaiah's nephew, was the horse's handler in private, and Isaiah had quietly instructed him to let the horse run just wild enough. Not dangerously, just enough to scatter attention, enough to buy minutes. At the creek bend, Naomi and Mary waited. The workman arrived, a quiet, almost invisible figure. He gave Naomi directions, spoken so softly the wind nearly carried them away. Naomi hugged her niece tightly, tears running silently. Mary clutched the bundle, her breath trembling, then stepped into the brush. Naomi watched until Mary vanished into the trees, swallowed by the green, leaving behind only broken twigs and the faint suggestion of hope. Back at Magnolia Grove, the stallion was finally subdued. Richard dusted off his coat and resumed his irritation with the disrupted schedule. "Where were we?" he muttered, snapping his ledger open again. "Ah, yes. Mary." Elellanar's stomach clenched. The overseer jogged toward the house, face flushed. "Sir," he called. "Mary ain't in the sick quarters. Naomi says she was there earlier, but well, she's gone." Richard's expression curdled into disbelief and then fury. "Run away? That girl?" he scoffed. "Search the grounds." He barked orders, sending men into the woods, into the fields, toward the creek bed. Elellanar felt her pulse drum against her ribs. Isaiah stood nearby, expression neutral in the practiced, perfect way of men who had learned that even breath could betray too much. Yet his eyes just for a second met hers, a glance so small anyone else would miss it. But she saw relief and fear knotted together in that glance, a silent acknowledgement of what had just been risked. Hours later, when the search returned empty and frustrated, Richard slammed the ledger shut. "Worthless nonsense," he muttered. "Not worth the trouble." He scratched out Mary's name with a flick of ink. The moment the ink dried, the sale proceeded with a brittle resentment. Other names were called. Other lives were tallied. Elellanar stood still as the world rearranged itself around the loss and escape of a child. She felt sick. But beneath that sickness was something sharp and unyielding. The knowledge that she had intervened in a way she could never undo. That evening, as dusk settled over Magnolia Grove, Elellanar stood at her bedroom window, staring toward the tree line. Somewhere beyond those dense woods, Mary was walking north under the guidance of people Elellanar would never meet. Isaiah passed below the window, heading toward the quarters. His silhouette stretched long in the dying light. He paused for only a breath, looked up, and Elellanar saw gratitude in his eyes, quiet, profound, and weighted with all the risk they now shared. Neither raised a hand, neither spoke. They understood the cost. The cellar had given them a moment of truth, but the daylight had asked for action. They had answered, and now, whether Magnolia Grove ever discovered the truth or not, the balance of their lives had shifted permanently, tilting toward a future neither of them could fully imagine, but one both of them could no longer ignore.